Hello and welcome to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most interesting backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, we go to New England for our first time on this show for a fantastic loop hike within reach of the most densely populated part of the United States. We go to a wilderness known for its ruggedness, beauty, and at times unpredictable weather. We travel a trail that takes hikers over 8 summits in 30 miles, or about 50 kilometers. The route has reservable camping, backcountry wild camping, and even 2 mountain huts similar to the refuges of the Alps. On this episode of Trails Worth Hiking, we traveled the Pemigewasset Loop in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Welcome to the show, everyone. Just a reminder that if you have ideas for episodes, feel free to reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. First, I want to mention on a segment that I think I'm now going to start calling Walking the Walk. And this is a segment where we mention listeners who have actually hiked a trail after listening to the show. Listener Morgan Fielder, who lives in Germany but is originally from Idaho in the United States, hiked the Rota Vicentina Fisherman's Trail in Portugal, which we profiled on episode 10. After hearing the episode, and she's actually going to be on the podcast on our next episode, and so she will talk a little bit about that then, in addition to covering a different trail. But it sounds like Morgan had a great time on the Rota Vicentina Fisherman's Trail. And if you haven't heard episode 10, I recommend checking it out. It's a really great episode about a really interesting coastal hike in Europe. One of the last places in Europe where you can really get kind of a wild, rugged coast that doesn't have a huge amount of population. On this episode, we talk about the Pemigewasset Loop, the Pemi Loop. Listener Dan Caney mentioned the Pemi Loop when he came on the show in episode 17, where we covered the Overland Track in Tasmania, Australia, another great episode that you should check out if you haven't. And so after hearing about the area from Dan, I looked into it a little bit and thought this would be a great route to cover on the show. So on this episode, we have our first foray into New England and the White Mountains of New Hampshire. This is a part of the country where I really want to hike but haven't. So this is an episode that definitely gets me thinking about it. Our guest on the show today is Max DesMarais. Max is the founder and creator of a website called hikingandfishing.com, which has some great information about not just different routes, but also lots of information about the outdoors as well. And Max will talk about that in our conversation. Max grew up in New Hampshire and spent a lot of time hiking various parts of the Pemi Loop over his lifetime, including a through hike that he's going to tell us about. So let's talk about this area a little bit. And we'll start with a story. In 1825, Samuel Willey and his family moved into what is today Crawford Notch in New Hampshire. And this is an area just a bit northeast of the Pemi Loop. Willey built a small inn for travelers to stop at as they came through this area. And the inn was in, as I mentioned, a notch. And what that means is it's a mountain pass. In August 1826, so only a year after they moved into this area, there was heavy rain that became a deluge after a couple of days of rain. And the Saco River that goes through the area rose 24 feet. Eventually, it got dammed up by some debris. After that, the flooding began. After the flooding subsided, people went to check on the Willeys. And their house was standing, undamaged, but there was nobody there. There were a number of landslides in the area, so people began searching to see if they could find the family. Eventually, their bodies were found. Most of the family was buried in the rubble of a landslide, along with a handyman who had worked at the family's inn. But one daughter's body was found unbruised on the opposite side of the river. And it seems what probably happened is the family had tried to escape the flooding to get to higher ground by leaving their home and unfortunately got caught in a landslide. And so it's possible that the one daughter had drowned even before that. It's unclear. On the dining room table in the house, there was a Bible found that was open to the 18th Psalm, which says, in part, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Then the channels of water were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He brought me forth also into a large place. He delivered me, because he delighted in me." So certainly the wrath of God and the risk that they were facing was something that the Willey family was aware of. Today, the Willey House site is still there in Crawford Notch, and Mount Willey is named after the family. And some say the Willeys never really left, even after they died. One hiker in August 2018 reported that after descending the ladders that are set up on the trail to the top of Mount Willey, he had already reached the summit and he was coming back down. And after descending the ladders, he came across a 10 or 11-year-old boy that was wearing a white shirt and blue shorts and was tapping a stick on the ground. The hiker wondered who would leave their kid all the way up there by himself. But then the boy looked up, gave him a devilish grin, and then disappeared right before his eyes. Jeremiah Willey, one of the Willey children, was 11 at the time he was killed. All right, so certainly some interesting lore about the White Mountains, and I thought I'd share at least that one story. The White Mountains cover a quarter of New Hampshire. They're basically the northern part of the Appalachians. Most of the White Mountains are part of the White Mountains National Forest. The most famous peak in the White Mountains is Mount Washington, which stands at 6,288 feet, which is 1,917 meters. And Mount Washington is the highest peak in the northeastern United States. It's in the Presidential Range, so called because several of the peaks in the range are named after U.S. presidents. But that's not what it's most famous for. Mount Washington is most famous for its really unpredictable weather, and in particular, its high winds. In fact, for 76 years, from 1934 to 1996, it held the record for the strongest winds ever recorded on Earth. There were winds recorded there on an April day, not even in the winter, of 231 miles per hour, which is 372 kilometers per hour. If you put aside tropical cyclone or tornado winds, which have since been recorded at higher speeds, that's still the fastest wind speed ever recorded. Nobody is clear on why these mountains are actually called the White Mountains. There's a couple leading theories. One is the snow-capped peaks can be seen from offshore, and ships coming into the area on the coast could see Mount Washington and some of the other peaks. And because they were snow-capped, they may have been called the White Mountains. But it could also be from the mica-laden granite that the White Mountains are predominantly made of that has kind of a white look to it. Another famous part of the White Mountains is the Old Man of the Mountain. And the Old Man of the Mountain is a rock face that, when you look at it from the side, has a profile that looks like a face. It was 40 feet tall and about 25 feet wide, and was called Stone Face from time immemorial by the indigenous Abenaki people. I say it was 40 feet high and 25 feet wide because in 2003, the face collapsed and is now gone, which is too bad because it was an iconic structure of the White Mountains and of New Hampshire. And if I remember correctly, I don't know if it still is, but for a long time it was actually on the New Hampshire license plate right next to their "Live Free or Die" slogan. So the Old Man of the Mountain is no more, but there are lots of pictures online if you want to see it. I mentioned the Abenaki people. Indigenous peoples have been in the region for 10,000 years. The Abenaki, the ones that were there most recently before Europeans arrived, are a people whose name is derived from the phrase "people of the Dawn Land." They're an Algonquian-speaking people. They didn't have any centralized authority, so there were lots of groups extended throughout parts of New England and eastern Canada, in Quebec primarily. And several Abenaki tribes are recognized officially in Vermont today, though not yet in New Hampshire. European settlement began with exploration in the mid-17th century. And I think the European settlement story is actually kind of an interesting one. After the Revolutionary War in the late 18th century, the area was cleared for farming, and it became quite an inhabited place by European settlers. But by the mid-19th century, lots of these farms were abandoned, and the forest returned. Apparently, there was better farming technology that favored different kinds of farms than these small farms in a mountainous region. And there was better land for farming to the west that had been discovered and made inhabitable by Europeans. And there was also growing urbanization in the United States, and so lots of people were leaving the countryside for the bigger cities. So the wilderness returned. But this eventually brought logging companies, and with that, eventually, lots of environmental destruction. In particular, there was a lot of havoc wreaked on the watersheds as clear-cutting happened. As a result of that, eventually in 1918, White Mountain National Forest was created to put the area under federal protection. And the Pemigewasset Wilderness is one area that definitely suffered from clear-cutting by loggers, but has recovered quite a bit with protection as a wilderness area. The Pemigewasset Wilderness is about 45,000 acres. As we've talked about before on the show, once you're protected as a wilderness area, you have special protections that go far beyond what a national forest has, including that no new structures are built, no new roads, no machinery of any kind is allowed to be used in them, among other things. There's quite a diverse flora and fauna in the area. There's bald eagle, white-tailed deer, moose, black bear, beaver, peregrine falcon, Canadian lynx, bobcat, fox, mink, and porcupine. The tree life is most predominantly red spruce, eastern hemlock, American beech, and red maple. As Max will talk about in our conversation, like a lot of New England, this area has some pretty fantastic fall colors. So with that background, let's jump into my conversation with Max DesMarais about the Pemi Loop. Max DesMarais, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about hikingandfishing.com.
Yeah, so basically, hikingandfishing.com is a website. It's a resource to help people get in the outdoors. It's filled with a whole bunch of information on different hiking trails across the US, and basically for each hiking trail, all the information that you need in order to go to that particular location, hike at that location, drive to that location, see weather, see trail maps, etc. In addition to that, we help connect people with adventure guides, think fly fishing guides, hiking guides, and climbing guides, and also help review and promote products to our readers.
So how did you hook up with the different guides and outfitters that you connect people to?
Yeah, it's a good question. So basically, it just sort of happened naturally. The website started to drive more traffic organically through Google. Through that process, I started to get people that were asking about, how can I hike this trail? Will you guide me? Do you know any guides? Those types of questions. And through getting more and more people asking those types of questions, I decided to reach out to some local guides and partner with them so that I could help send them individuals that are looking for guides and connect people that are looking with guides with the people that can best serve them.
And I saw that you also have some gear reviews on the site and as well as some trail guides.
Yeah, that's right. We get to use a lot of gear. I get to use a lot of gear on, my normal weekend adventures, and that gives me a good testing ground to test out different gear and help people find the gear that's best for them.
And how did you get interested in hiking and fishing and other outdoor activities?
I don't really know the answer truly. I know as a young kid, I used to go hiking pretty regularly with my parents and my dad, and then kind of lost sight of hiking and fishing really until high school, when I started to do a little bit more hiking and got into spin fishing and bass fishing in the Lakes region area of New Hampshire. Then ended up going to college in Durham, New Hampshire at the University of New Hampshire, and It was there that I basically found fly fishing, and I found the New Hampshire 4,000 footers, and quickly got into hiking the New Hampshire 4,000 footers and quickly got into fly fishing. And they both became my absolute obsessions within a few months. And from there, I was, hiking and fishing every single weekend.
So I think that's pretty cool that you're into both of those things and sort of to the extreme level, because a lot of people are either into hiking or fishing. And then there are plenty of people that like to go to backcountry lakes and spend a few days fishing or fishing the streams. But there's not a lot of people that are trying to hit, the tall peaks and do fishing.
Yeah, peaks to creeks. I don't know. I just really love it. It's a good mix of activities. One's very athletic based, and sometimes trail running is a hard workout day, and then longer hikes can be great long endurance activities, and followed by a nice day of fishing. I just love the combination.
And so you grew up in New Hampshire and you went to college in New Hampshire, but now you live in Colorado. How'd that happen?
Yeah, the girlfriend got me out there basically. She ended up joining the master's program at Colorado State University. So I made the trek out there with her, and now I'm out in Colorado doing the exact same things I was doing in New Hampshire, just in a new place with some new mountains and new streams.
So that's not a bad place to land for someone who's into the outdoors.
No, I always describe it to people I know as a giant New Hampshire. It's basically like New Hampshire with more people. The mountains are a little bigger. There's even more rivers. You just don't have the ocean right there. Yeah, but most people, have no reference point of New Hampshire anyways. So
I'm not going to try to get you to pit New Hampshire wilderness against Colorado wilderness, but what do you love about both, or how are they different in the way that you love them?
Yeah, they're very, very different for sure. I remember on my drive across the country when we were moving out here, the lack of trees freaked me out at first. You just feel like the open air. Not to say that Colorado doesn't have trees. There's a whole lot of trees, but there's a big difference when hiking, because oftentimes you're starting a hike in a place where you have a great viewpoint, or you're quickly hiking above tree line, and you have a larger amount of time kind of in the viewpoints or above tree line. And it's just an entirely different experience that way. I would say the other big factor, which most avid hikers of East and West Coast will tell you, is the trail conditions are often very different from East to West. West Coast trails, though they have plenty of trails that are very rough and very steep, there's just a trend of there's more switchbacks. It tends to be better maintained than East Coast trails that'll have like roots and rocks everywhere, and often kind of take this straight up approach to a lot of peaks. And so some will say that the East Coast trails might be a little rough and more difficult and technical when you're talking about non-technical trails. And I've definitely kind of noticed that trend as well.
Yeah. So even though the trails in Colorado or in California, for example, are much higher elevation and altitude, they're easier grades to hike and not as difficult step by step.
Yeah, absolutely. Some people get really affected by the elevation too, in Colorado specifically, where that might play a major role in how your day goes out, especially if you were just coming from lower elevations and moving up to higher elevations. It can make the hike a bit more difficult. So there's that aspect as well.
All right. So we're going to talk today about a hike in your home state. We're going to talk about the Pemigewasset Loop, the Pemi Loop. I guess my first question typically is how somebody came across a trail, learned about a trail, but I'm guessing you've known about this trail quite a while since it's from your home state.
Yeah, I've definitely known about it for quite some time. I would say, really though, growing up, I didn't know that the Pemi Loop was a sought after trail. I would say probably in the high school to college time frame when I learned about the New Hampshire 48 4,000 footers, which is, all the New Hampshire 48 peaks that are above 4,000 feet in elevation, is when I learned about the Pemi Loop, because it's a great way to experience multiple peaks in one day hike or a multi-day trip. And it's got some of the best views in the state. So it's pretty well renowned. So I've been on the loop. I don't even know how many times, probably 50 to 75 times I've done hikes on the loop, but I've actually only done the loop fully myself once. The rest of the time have all been section hikes or trail hikes or hikes that just happen to include sections of it. And you'll find a lot of people in New Hampshire have that same experience where they got to do the loop once, but they've done portions of the loop dozens of times.
What attracted you to finally deciding at some point you've got to do the whole loop?
It's just a classic loop. Honestly, I think being on those peaks, I started to recognize that some of my favorite viewpoints in all of New England really came on some of the summits that happen to be part of the Pemi Loop. And so identifying that there's this one hike that connects all of these summits that happen to be my most favorite summits, I was like, I have to do this multi-day trek for sure.
And so when you did the entire loop, did you do it as a multi-day hike?
Yeah, I did a two night hike, a 3-day hike.
Perfect.
But people do single day adventures. People do, 1 night adventures, 2 night adventures, and 3 night adventures are all relatively common.
And so what did you do to go about planning that trip when you did the entire through hike, the entire loop? What did you do as far as thinking about where you were going to spend your nights or how you were going to think about food, water, all those things?
As someone who started a website on these things, I definitely started primarily research online and was actually probably a little disappointed in all the available research out there in terms of, all right, where are the water stops? Where's the best starting point? Should I go clockwise? Should I go counterclockwise? Which is probably what compelled me to write an in-depth article on the Pemi Loop itself that details those things for people that are trying to hike it. But really, it started with online research, then looking at trail maps and deciding, if I start here and go this direction, this seems like it's going to be the best fit for what I'm looking to try and do for this, 2-night hike. I'm assuming I'll have enough time this way. I can see, there's water generally here, and basically taking a look at trail maps and using really any type of paper map, as well as using tools like Gaia or FatMap or any of those online map tools that really help you, plan out a hike.
And so the article you referred to is the complete guide to the Pemi Loop, the best of New Hampshire's White Mountains, which is your article on hikingandfishing.com. And I should mention, you just talked about having to pull together maps from different sources. You put together a nice little map on your website, on your article, and I have that in front of me now. And that seems, I'm not sure that's all you need, but it's a pretty darn helpful map for somebody who wants to do the loop.
Yeah, I think it probably is all that you need. I would definitely recommend that someone has something with more detail so you can see side trails a little bit better. But yeah, I recognize that when you're looking at most paper maps or even online maps, it becomes hard to tell, specifically with backpacking trips, where can I camp? Where are there campgrounds? Where can I stealth camp? Where can I get water? And those are the types of things I was like, let me just overlay this on an existing map so that I can help someone who's trying to do the same loop.
So anyone who does want to do this hike easily can go to your website and pull down that map. So what can you tell us about the White Mountains in New Hampshire? And particularly for somebody like me, I'm from California. I've been to Vermont and New Hampshire on family trips and things like that, but I've never really done serious outdoor adventure in that part of the country. It's partly why I'm so interested in hearing about it. So for someone who's never been to the White Mountains, who might be a listener, what can you tell them about what the White Mountains are like and why they're worth visiting?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely have a lot of pride of the White Mountains with it being my home state, so I might be a bit biased. But first of all, they're extremely accessible mountains comparatively to some other mountains that exist there in the United States and the world. You have a couple major highways and byways in New Hampshire that enable you to get access right up close to these peaks so that you have great trailhead access to gorgeous mountains and getting away from the crowds of people relatively easily. So the ease of access makes it really unique in that aspect. And secondarily, the views are just extremely unique. You got these beautiful green trees in summertime. In the fall time, they turn to incredible fall colors. And then in the winter, you get an entirely different experience. So I think one of my favorite parts and most unique parts about the White Mountains is the extremely distinct seasons. And if you hike the same peak in each season, you're going to get an insanely different experience. And it's almost like hiking in an entirely different destination, which is part of why I love the White Mountains, because you can get such a wide variety of experience in a single year if you wanted to.
And even though the White Mountains aren't that far from, like you said, like major highways or accessible to major cities, these are pretty serious wilderness, and the weather can be very dangerous at times even.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for bringing that. White Mountains are definitely notorious for their crazy weather. I've experienced a lot harder winds in New Hampshire than I've ever experienced in Colorado. I've experienced a lot colder weather than I've ever experienced in Colorado, even at altitude. And those conditions do exist in New Hampshire, even though you're talking about 4,000 and 5,000 foot summits, and sometimes even lower summits have these same conditions. You're starting a lot lower than you are starting in some of these Western states with higher elevation, but you're getting incredible weather experiences sometimes. And therefore, it's very important to take the mountains extremely seriously, because you can experience extremely high winds very quickly, You can experience extreme temperature changes and precipitation very quickly. That's why it's really important to go prepared and have the right gear and make sure you know what you're doing, because there's definitely still danger that exists in the White Mountains. And as you know, probably know, Mount Washington is famous for having, some of the highest recorded wind speeds on the planet. And it's very real, and it happens pretty regularly in the White Mountains, where the winds can be pretty crazy and the temperatures can drop pretty quickly.
So that's a good segue into talking about some of the logistics for doing this hike. Is this really a summer and early fall hike, or is this doable in spring? Is it doable in winter? What do you think?
The truth is, it's absolutely doable year round, but you definitely want to have the necessary experience, especially if you're going to be doing it in winter months, just because you can experience that wild weather and extreme cold temperatures and extreme wind and icy conditions that are dangerous if you don't have the right gear with you in winter specifically. Most people are going to do this hike in summer and fall. Spring is a little less hiked just because the White Mountains can be very muddy with snowmelt, making the trails difficult to travel on and easy to get your boot filled with mud, but also buggy in those spring months. So primarily people who are looking for kind of the easiest time of year, it's going to be the summertime and the fall time. Those are also going to be the busiest times of year, but it is certainly an accessible hike year round.
I noticed on your website, on the article, you actually had linked to current weather conditions, which I thought was kind of cool.
Yes, it was one thing that I wanted to make sure that people had access to. I think what I have on my website in terms of weather isn't all the details that people should be paying attention to, but it gives you a good idea. Make sure you check the weather before you head out there, because it can be vastly different, especially if you're, say, traveling from the seacoast up to New Hampshire. You could have literally 40-degree different temperatures and high winds. And if you're not prepared for that, you're in for a much more difficult experience than you'd expect.
So how long of a trip is this as far as distance?
I think all the resources will say it's between 28 and 29 miles to do the whole loop, with about 9,000 feet of vertical gain, which makes it a pretty substantial hike. However, I always tell people there's one spur trail that you have to take, which is the spur to West Bond, which adds about a half mile each way, a mile total, and a little bit of elevation gain. So we're talking about 30-mile loop with about a little over 9,000 feet of elevation gain.
And so that's about 50 kilometers as well.
Yep.
Okay. You mentioned that when you did this as a through hike, you did it over 3 days. Is that a pretty comfortable pace for most people, you think?
Yeah, generally that's probably the most common way that people tackle this hike. It enables you to have basically 2 reasonably long hiking days, small to medium-sized hiking days, and generally one day that's pushing more mileage. And that tends to be a great balance for people.
And as far as gear, I would guess standard sort of mountain backpacking gear works pretty well. But I also noticed in your article that you mentioned the option of hammock camping. We talk for a moment about why you think that's a good option for a trip like this.
Yeah. First of all, in the peak season, some of the stealth campsites can get pretty full, as well as some of the tent sites that are established that have, caretakers there, meaning that you might be left with fewer good kind of stealth backcountry options, meaning a hammock option might be a great setup. Plus, the whole hike, generally speaking, has, good tree coverage aside from the upper summits. So between the summits, there's several great places where hammock setups might be ideal and really comfortable and light to carry.
And probably pretty good to avoid, if you're on the early end of the season, to avoid a lot of the boggy sort of wet parts.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and speaking of water, what about water on this trip? It's water filtration, I assume, is necessary where there is water. But I noticed, I think in your guide, that there's a 14-mile waterless stretch, which is pretty much half of the hike. So
Yeah.
How do you plan for that particular stretch?
Yeah, so there's a couple options for that stretch. There's a couple spurs that you can take that lead to a really great water source that will add mileage, but you'd have to take that spur in order to get it. So for example, if you're leaving from the Lincoln Woods Trail and heading towards Franconia Ridge, basically, there's the Liberty Springs tent site, which has water available. And if you continue on towards Mount Lafayette, there's also the one of the AMC huts right off the summit of Lafayette. Or I shouldn't say right off the summit. You got to drop several hundred feet to get there, where there's ample water. But that whole stretch, you're really above tree line, and for a good portion of that stretch, and you're ridge hiking. So the water access is extremely limited. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense for people to stop at those water access points and get water there. or pack enough water that you can fully make it through that stretch. It's definitely worth noting because there is that, pretty substantial stretch of not great water access. Though it is New Hampshire in the White Mountains, so there is possibilities at times of year that you could find not so great water or creeks flowing through, but it's better to be more prepared.
So you mentioned stealth camping and you mentioned the huts. What is the situation for camping? It seems like from your article, there's quite a variety of options. And, for someone planning, what should they be thinking about as far as reservable sites versus the huts versus stealth camping?
It's definitely up to a user's preference, but the truth with the huts is that they operate on reservations. They're more expensive. They're obviously really amazing experiences, but they're limited in where they're placed. You have to go a little off trail to get to them. They have the comfort of a bed and really great food. So that's a great option for someone that is in I'm not sure the glamping of backcountry side of things. It's a really great option.
It's almost like a European trekking option a little bit.
Exactly. There's a lot of the New Hampshire White Mountains that have these huts that make for some really great experiences, and the Pemi Loop happens to have a couple of those options there.
Are they spaced so that you could do the trip and just stay one night in each of them and do a 3-day trip that way?
Yeah, they're reasonably spaced for you to do that on this hike. If you do it clockwise, your last day is going to be a very long one, or your first day is going to be a very long one if you go counterclockwise. But it's certainly, they are spaced in such a way that it's feasible. Of course, before you decide that, make sure you recognize the distance and elevation gain and loss in between them, because there is pretty substantial amounts between them. But it is certainly a trick that people do sometimes.
Okay. And so what about the backcountry sites versus the stealth sites?
There's a few main they're called tent sites or campsites that are basically, there's not a reservation system. You show up and it's first come, first serve. And there's generally a person there to collect fees and make sure people are following the proper rules of those tent sites. And they generally have a few tent sites available as well as overflow. But in peak season, they do fill up relatively fast. So when that does occur, people are basically required to what's considered backcountry camp or stealth camp, which means going off trail, not camping within a quarter mile of any other hut or tent site or trailhead, and making sure that you're at least 250 feet off the trail. And if you do that, you're actually within the rules and regulations of being able to what's considered stealth camp. So camping at not an established tent site or campground. So there's a large portion of people that do that for avoiding those tent sites. And you will find in the backcountry of New Hampshire that there is sort of like semi-established areas where people do this pretty frequently.
And so what about getting to this hike? And you mentioned it's close to major highways, but as far as cities, if you're coming from a different part of the country, what's the easiest way to get to this hike?
Primarily, most people fly into Boston, which is still a ways away. We're talking about a little bit over of a 2-hour drive from Boston up to the White Mountains to kind of the closer trailheads on the Pemi Loop. So that's going to be the most common way that people travel from other parts of the country to this area. But you will find that some people will travel into some of the more local airports as well. Obviously, those flights are significantly more expensive. There's also some larger airports in Vermont and Maine that you could fly into, but those are generally going to be even further than Boston.
Okay. You mentioned that there might be options for trailheads. What do you think is the best option people consider for where to start the hike and also which direction to go?
Most people tend to start at the Lincoln Woods trailhead, mainly because it's got a very large parking lot. It seems like a better place to keep your car over the weekend. There's generally a ranger at the ranger station of that parking lot. There's bathrooms and water and kind of some facilities right there, as well as it being right next to the nearby town of Lincoln. So it's really accessible there. The secondary benefit of that is you're starting on very flat ground. So your first mile and a half before you make any turn at all is basically perfectly flat on what was an old logging railroad. And it follows the east branch of the Pemigewasset River, which makes it a really great option to start because you're starting in a relatively simple area, you're ending in a relatively simple area, you've got a big parking lot, and there's a small day fee. I think the day fee is $5 per day now, which is just a self-serve station where you put a little ticket on your card and pay via an envelope.
And what if you want to stay the night before? It sounds like the town, I assume, has accommodations, but are there campgrounds nearby as well?
Yep, there's also campgrounds. I don't know how many there are within 10 miles of that, but there's several great campgrounds for people to stay at. There's some that are literally less than a mile away that people commonly stay at.
So in your article, you mentioned you rated this as an extremely difficult hike. And I just wanted to get a sense of why that is and what makes this hike so difficult.
First off, it's 30 miles with, 9,000+ feet of elevation gain. That, in my mind, automatically makes it a pretty strenuous hike. Of course, if you stretch it out over multiple days, that decreases what would be considered the difficulty of it. But it's hiking in New Hampshire, which means you're going to have rough trails. You're going to potentially experience a lot of weather, and you're going to experience quick changes in elevation. So you're going to experience steep ups and downs throughout those 30 miles, which is why you're experiencing so much elevation gain and loss. Therefore, I rate it difficult or extremely strenuous because of those features of the hike.
For someone who's planning a long weekend kind of trip and wants to do basically a 3-day itinerary, is there a particular itinerary that you would recommend that makes the most sense? Like, where should they be thinking about stopping? If they start at Lincoln Woods and they go, I don't know if it would be clockwise or counterclockwise that you think makes the most sense, depending on, where the stopping points are.
Yep.
But what could you say as far as a pretty good itinerary for people to go by?
I generally recommend, like you said, a 3-day, a 2-night trip starting at Lincoln Woods, and you go clockwise. I say clockwise more so because I want people to end on what I think are the coolest parts of the hike, which is the Mount Bond and West Bond area. That enables people to start up a gradual trail to the first 4,000 footer of the loop of Mount Flume. And that trail is actually rated as kind of one of the easier trails to summit a 4,000 footer because it just has a nice gradual great gain to the summit over a relatively short distance as well. So that enables you to get right up to the beautiful kind of Franconia Ridge and do incredible ridge hiking from there. It also is a good stopping point if you were to choose the Liberty Springs tent site or to camp at the AMC hut just below Mount Lafayette. So I tend to have people go that way because of that. However, some people will want to go the other direction because it's easier to find a short initial day hike camping area. So it's really about your personal preference. Always my first recommendation tends to be Lincoln Woods, 3 days, clockwise trip. And that's just my personal preference more than anything.
Okay, and so that would be the Greenleaf Hut. That's the first one that comes up.
Yep, correct. For the AMC huts. Yep.
And if you were camping, you're kind of in that area as well. And then where would you camp the second night?
Second night, I'd love for people to be able to make it far enough to get to the Gio shelter. It puts a long day in the middle there, depending upon where you stay that first night. But that Gio shelter area not only has the tent sites that you can purchase, but there's also plenty of backcountry and stealth sites basically in that whole area around all of the peaks right there. So there's a lot of good backcountry sites available there. And in my opinion, it's one of the best places in the entire country to see both sunset and sunrise. So I want to make sure that people are in that area for both of those.
And it looks like you've got the West Bond Summit as a small detour you might want to do. And then also you've got Mount Bond that's right on the trail.
Yes, exactly. So I would say of my favorite views in all of New England, it's standing on West Bond and standing on Mount Bond, just because the incredible 360 views, very unique landscape around you. It's one of the few areas that you can be in New England and see just a vast array of wilderness that's untouched by roads and buildings. So it's just one of my favorite views of all time is in that very short stretch of trail there.
So West Bond sounds like a good small side trip. It looks like it's only about half a mile each way on the map. Are there other side trips throughout this hike that you think are worth stopping for?
Yeah, for sure. My favorite secondary side trip is going to Mount Galehead, which is located just off of the Twins. And there's actually an AMC hut, the Galehead hut there. I recommend that because that's how you get to that it's one of the ways to get to that 4,000 foot peak. It's a good checkbox if you're trying to hike the New Hampshire 48 4,000 footers. It's just a really cool summit because you're just kind of in this small dome summit in the middle of the Pemi wilderness with really unique and cool views. That detour is short in terms of mileage. I think it's 0.8 or 0.9 miles each way, but you drop a significant amount of elevation in that very short period of time. So to me, that's a really great detour to make. Another detour would be towards Franconia Falls, which is a really great option off of the east branch of the Pemi River there. Just beautiful waterfalls, and you're not having to go very far off trail, and it's relatively flat. So that's a great detour as well.
And so it looks like if you stop at the Gio campsite your second night doing the clockwise route, not too bad a day on the last day. You've got a pretty big uphill in the beginning, but then it looks like it's not too horrible after that. You're going to get to the parking lot at a reasonable hour.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. The great thing about that shelter is, like you said, you have a bit of up at the beginning, but once you hit Bond Cliff, which is kind of if you're doing a clockwise loop, that's going to be your last summit and your last 4,000-foot peak. You're in for a really gradual trip back down to the parking lot, which makes it, even though the mileage might be long for the day, since the summit of Bond Cliff is 9 miles from the trailhead, and the summit of Mount Bond and the Gio shelter, so the Gio shelter specifically, I think is just shy of 11 miles away from the trailhead. That mileage is actually not too bad because of the last 6 or so miles being relatively gradual downgrade. And actually the last 3 or so miles on the trail are basically flat along the river and along an old logging railroad.
So at the end of the day, when you think back about this trip, why is this a trail people should be thinking about hiking?
Number one, it's got some of the best views in all of New England. Many would argue some of the best views in the country. You get to experience some land in New England that's hard to come by, which is, land that's untouched by roads and buildings. It's super accessible in terms of easy driving to get there. It's filled with a whole bunch of incredible views and packed into one weekend adventure, basically.
And when you did the through hike over those 3 days, that was a solo trip?
Yes.
When you think back on that particular trip versus all your other sort of day hikes and doing parts of the trail, do you have a particular memory or a particular moment that stands out in doing a trip that way, by yourself for 3 days versus sort of day hiking sections?
Some of my most fun experiences, maybe not necessarily on the Pemi Loop, have been hiking alone or being alone out in the wilderness. It's an entirely different experience than hiking with other people. I particularly remember the Pemi Loop. I got absolutely dumped on by rain for like a couple hours. And in the moment, I was thinking how terrible this was. But right afterwards, when it stopped raining, it was awesome. I mean, it's just those types of moments when you have adversity or something's not going as planned, feel so much better later. Some call it type 2 fun. It's absolutely true. And you get a lot of that when hiking alone. Sometimes you're thinking about other people, want to be with other people. And, sometimes you're absolutely enjoying the moment and being out there all by yourself. And a mix of all of that is just an awesome experience. Plus, when I'm alone, for some reason, I tend to run across more animals, which probably isn't necessarily a good thing. But I've had some interesting experiences with animals on the trail alone.
I agree with everything you just said. It's a totally different experience, and it's not to knock having an experience with a family or with friends, and those are great experiences in their own way. But I really love solo trips also, and for a lot of the reasons you just said. You just get a kind of special relationship with the place you're in. And the point about animals is true as well, I think, because you're quieter, right? You're not talking with somebody the whole time. So, you can definitely get more up close contact with a lot of the animals that live in the wilderness. As you look back at this particular trip where you did this 3-day route, is there anything you would have done differently? Anything gear or campsite choice or just anything that didn't work out the way you expected besides a little rain or a lot of rain maybe?
Yeah, it was a lot of rain.
Okay.
Yeah, and I got absolutely obliterated and very wet very quickly. But honestly, no, I think if you're prepared and you have the right gear, really it's going to go pretty well as long as you plan generally within a few miles where you think is a good camping spot. Honestly, if I were going to do it again, which I'm definitely going to do it again, I'm definitely going to do a trail run of a day of it. I definitely want to do it as a day trip, but that's just my own personal thing. I really like doing some longer trail runs and enjoying some long, hardworking days like that.
All right, Max, thanks for telling us about your hike of the Pemi Loop. But while I have you, I've got a few more questions for you.
Sure.
What's the next trip on your list?
Well, as you know, I'm out here in Colorado. So I'm actually very close to finishing the Colorado 14ers. And so I have, some smaller trips planned and day hikes and some 14ers fixed in, but I plan on finishing the 14ers next summer. And I'm really looking forward to my next trip, which is the Chicago Basin. which encompasses 4 14ers and basically a 40-mile weekend of backpacking into some of the most remote peaks in Colorado. So I'm very excited about that one. It should be an absolute blast.
Is that going to be a trail hike, or is it cross country, or a mix of both?
The Chicago Basin is actually unique because you have the option to take a train to a closer trailhead. So you can cut off about 12 miles round trip by taking a train, or you can hike basically from a trailhead that offers, I wouldn't call it road hiking, but relatively simple trails into the basin, which takes your trip to, I forget how many miles it is, but like 20 plus miles to get into the basin. And then once you're in the basin, you have, incredible wilderness and backcountry that's uninhibited by much. And you have technical peaks in front of you that you have to climb to get the 14er. So you get a bit of everything in that type of hike.
That sounds great. So what is a backpacking meal you could eat every day?
Yeah, it's a great question. My answer is unconventional, and it's not an answer that I would say I could eat every day, but it's a little bit of a hack, or I would say a backpacking hack, which is purchasing pasta sides, because depending upon where you get them, they're going to be $1 to $1.50 per pasta side. They have tons of flavors. All you need is a little boiling water, and you can make a really delicious meal with plenty of calories to sustain you. And the little packs are super tiny and they weigh pretty much nothing. So that's kind of my go-to now. And I owe that idea to my buddy Mike, who I thought he was insane when he told me that. And then I realized it probably makes more sense in a lot of cases to bring a couple extra pasta sides and skip out on one or two of those very expensive backpacking meals.
Nice. Is that Knorr? Is that one of the Knorr brand, like Knorr?
Yeah, you can find knockoff brands too. They're all really cheap regardless. But
Okay.
really any of those little pasta side like things where it's, just add water, or a lot of them say add water, a touch of milk and butter. You can skip the milk and butter if you just put in some boiling water in your pot in that pasta side. It's going to come out tasting pretty good, especially when you're really hungry.
Okay. Next question. What's the most unexpected thing that's ever happened while you were backpacking?
This was on a trip by myself, and I wouldn't call it backpacking. I was in this case, I'm just ruining your questions here, but
That's okay. You were out hiking at least.
Yeah, I was out hiking. I was actually doing a trail run solo mixed with hiking by myself on Mount Isolation in New Hampshire, where I was basically going up to a 4,000-foot peak, which involves beautiful trail. I was going up the Boot Spur near Mount Washington, which is one of my favorite sections of trail in all of the White Mountains. And on my way back from the summit of Mount Isolation, I was trail running, minding my own business, and I took a corner in one of the very tight pine sections. So you really couldn't see far. And I was literally 5 feet face to face from a giant bull moose, and his rack was literally 6 feet wide. And I was 5 feet away from him, 6 feet away from him, and I stopped super fast. He looked at me, he was staring at me straight in the eyes, and he was not happy that I was there. He was making some grunting noises, and I was very afraid in that very split second moment where I thought, if he charges me, there's no way that I'm getting out of this. So I had stopped in my tracks and slowly made my way backwards, and he started to kind of follow me. And I spent about 15 minutes backtracking, actually probably longer than that, backtracking as he followed me through the woods, moving very, very fast. I was running and he's just meandering through. But his rack was so big that a large portion of the parts of the trail, he kept having to tilt his head to get through the trail. And you could just hear him bashing through the trees. And it was one of the coolest and most unique experiences I've had. And I got some really great videos that day.
And did ultimately he just eventually kind of decided you weren't a problem and wandered off?
Yeah, so what happened is I reached a junction in the trail and I got to scramble up and climb a little bit. It was actually the spur to the summit of Mount Isolation. And at that junction, he actually walked right past me and I was able to get back on the trail and continue the direction I wanted to. It was one of those super dense forest sections of trail where it's actually really hard to get off the trail. I don't think he could have if he wanted to, which is why he kept having to stay on it and why I had to keep going in the other direction until he got off of it.
Yeah, that's not the kind of traffic jam you want to be in.
No, but I wouldn't take it back because it was a pretty awesome experience.
Yeah, I mean, after it's one of those things that afterward you think that was pretty fantastic, but
Yeah, exactly.
For the moment, it's a little scary.
I was Definitely very scared.
Last question. What is the most valuable thing that backpacking or hiking has taught you?
To me, it's really about consistency and persistence and diligence and hard work. Hiking, especially on long distance trails, takes a lot of hard work. And oftentimes you go through these ups and downs throughout your hike, especially if you're hiking alone, where you just don't want to continue. Even if you're experiencing amazing views, you might be working really hard or not. And sometimes you just want to turn around and go back and maybe grab some food. And it's in those moments where I feel like humans can get the most growth when you persevere through some of those hard times and keep pushing yourself. You end up on the other side of it, and when you do that, you're rewarded greatly, not just in the moment, but you're often rewarded after the fact. It goes back to that type two fun that exists, especially in hiking and running, where you feel extremely happy about what you accomplished or did after the fact. And even in the moment when you may have not been perfectly happy. To me, that's a larger lesson for life, which is, keep pushing through and keep persevering. And it's a good parallel.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. All of what you said, I agree with. I think of backpacking as sort of a intense version of real life. The way the ups and downs maybe happen more often and more quickly than they do in real life, all within an hour of each other, the ups and the downs. But because of that, you do learn a lot and you come out of it on the other side feeling a lot stronger, I think. And you're right that it's hard. And I mean, a lot of people who don't do backpacking, who maybe have day hiked a little bit in their life but never really done long distance backpacking, have really no idea how difficult it is and how physically strenuous it is and how you do sometimes just want to give up, but you might be 20 or 30 miles from a trailhead. And so, there's really no option to give it up, which is great because at the end of it, you come out feeling like you've accomplished something, and you have. So I agree with all of that. I think that's a great sentiment and a good place to end the show. Max DesMarais, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again to Max for coming on the show. I hope Max and I have inspired you to hike the Pemi Loop. And if you've enjoyed this episode, tell a friend about it, or better yet, give us a good review on whichever podcast service you use. And keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense. And when you get back, tell me how it went. Before we go, I want to remind you once again about the discount that Trails Worth Hiking listeners get at OutdoorHerbivore.com. Outdoor Herbivore has great vegan and vegetarian backpacking meals. And as I always say, you don't need to be a vegan or vegetarian to enjoy them. They have quality ingredients, lots of calories for a hungry hiker, and are packed in convenient boil-in-a-bag packaging where you just need to pour in hot water and stir and seal them up for 10 minutes before you eat them. I think I mentioned last episode that I was going on a trip this last month, and I did that. I went out to Point Reyes for a 3-day backpacking trip. And for the 2 nights, I had Outdoor Herbivore meals for my dinners. I believe I had the peanutty matchsticks, which is a pasta with peanut sauce, kind of a spicy Asian pasta, which I really enjoyed. And I also had the chickpea sesame ziti, which is one of my standbys that I eat on pretty much almost every backpacking trip. So you could give one of those options a try if you're interested. Trails Worth Hiking listeners get a discount of 10% with the discount code TWH10P, as in Trails Worth Hiking 10%, TWH10P. So check out Outdoor Herbivore at OutdoorHerbivore.com. Let's talk about our next episode. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we jump back across the pond to Europe to hike a beautiful mountain trail that has enormous payoff in views for pretty reasonable effort required. This is not just a route for hardened adventurers who like to rough it. As we'll see, this might even be a fantastic trek to take your family on. We'll enjoy fantastic food and welcoming mountain refugios, where we'll encounter a wide range of travelers along this route of 120 kilometers or 75 miles. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we travel to Alta Via 1, in the Dolomites of northern Italy. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode, ideas for future episodes, including if you want to be a guest and talk about a trail that you've hiked, please reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. So start planning your next hike. And before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.